The COVID pandemic has turned rental markets upside down. Renters may not be paying, landlords may not be paying their mortgage. What are the rights and responsibilities? Will there be landlord relief soon? And when will the court system be back in place? Find out here in today's Asked and Answered. Hi, everybody. This is Richard with Viridian Mortgage, and we have Michael McLaughlin with us today. Michael is an eviction attorney. He's been practicing law for 21 years and is currently a partner at McLaughlin Sanchez. And we're so glad to have him here with us today with all the issues that are going on with the COVID pandemic. Michael, thank you for sharing your time with us. We'll just get right down to it. What's going on with your landlord clients, with the eviction moratoriums? There's all sorts of guidelines depending on what jurisdiction you're talking about. Tell us what you're seeing with your practice in San Francisco County.
Yeah, thanks so much, Richard. Yeah, that really is that really puts the finger right on it. It really depends on the county you're in. So there are really two things that are going on right now. First, there is a moratorium, generally speaking, on efforts to recover possession. So you can't really even proceed with a notice terminating a tenancy until the shelter-in-place order is lifted. But the rules depend on the county that you're in. So you really need to check the county rules and the specific rules before you make any move to terminate a tenant's tenancy right now. And the second thing that's really going on is statewide, uniformly, there's a moratorium on the courts proceeding with eviction actions. And specifically, the current rules state that the clerks of the county courts are not issuing a summons for a complaint for unlawful detainer, an eviction complaint, for 90 days following the date that the governor lifts the state of emergency. And it's really important to keep in mind that that's not when the governor says some of us can go back to the workplace and the shelter-in-place rules can be eased. It's when the governor says that we're all clear and there's no longer an emergency. Then 90 days after that, the clerks will issue a summons, which is required to proceed on an eviction action.
Wow, that can be quite some time, especially seeing that a lot of renters have already missed their April 1st payment and we're into May already. So what advice are you giving landlords right now? What kind of remedies do they have that are available?
Well, it's really important to keep in mind, and I think this is the most important thing going on right now for both residential and commercial tenants. Here are the basic rules. If a tenant has a financial difficulty related to the shutdown, they are able to notify the landlord, provide documentation of the financial hardship, and then that rent is deferred for up to 6 months after the shelter-in-place order is lifted. There's not a lot that a landlord can do if the tenant comes and has a bona fide or a genuine financial hardship. The biggest advice I can give to people is keep good records. Keep good records of what the tenant told you, the documents that they gave you, a good solid rent roll. And that's really what I'm seeing right now. On the residential side, there's not a lot of flexibility. On the commercial side, it depends again on your jurisdiction. For example, in San Francisco, the courts are requiring that landlords and tenants negotiate a repayment plan in good faith. And so it's really, really super important to check the particular rules for your jurisdiction if you do have a tenant who can't pay the rent right now.
Right, and sometimes that's the only option, is to at least get something rather than nothing, right?
Yeah, once again, Richard, you've nailed it, and this is the biggest issue that I see going forward. So let's take a look into the future and see what that looks like. What's going to happen if you have a tenant, for example, that has 4 or 5 months of deferred rent? Tenants, generally speaking, particularly residential tenants, they live month to month. The chances that the tenant is going to be able to catch up with you, say on $8,000 or $10,000 in deferred rent, is really remote. So then what? And right now the rules are different by county as well. In Alameda County, for example, in Oakland, you will be able to sue that residential tenant for that balance due, for that $8,000 or $10,000 in deferred rent, for example, say in the small claims court, but you won't be able to evict them for that non-payment of rent. That rule is different in San Francisco. In San Francisco, if you had the same tenant, you could, if after 6 months they're still unable to pay you that deferred rent, then you could terminate the tenancy. on that basis. But I expect that that rule will probably be changed legislatively, because I just don't see the courts entertaining mass evictions for people whose only reason for falling behind was the COVID-related financial hardship.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of the timeline, it's just, I can't even imagine. You're talking about waiting for the restrictions to be lifted and then 90 days. And then how are the courts going to handle all these new summons and all these new filings?
It's such a good question, and it really, just from a public policy standpoint, really we're going to have I think essentially we're going to have a question come down, and that is this: who's going to bear the financial burden of this shutdown? It's either going to be the tenants or it's going to be the landlords, because if we allow a tenant to defer, say, 4 or 5 months of rent, and they're not able to catch up, and the law changes such that the landlord is only able to go to, say, the small claims court and get a judgment, the tenant likely is judgment proof. So essentially what we're doing is we're shifting the financial burden of this entire thing over to the landlord class from the tenants, because and I don't know this to be true, but I'm guessing that the courts are not going to be wanting to entertain hundreds of thousands or millions of eviction cases across the state of California because tenants are not able to get caught up on deferred rent.
Have you heard anything on the legislative front about any government assistance to landlords to help subsidize any missing rent?
Well, there are emergency disaster loans available at the federal level, but I haven't heard of anything right now at the state level. But, we're in the midst of this thing right now. So it's impossible to really say what the legislature will do if they step in. But I think that once the dust settles and we actually begin to move out of this entire affair, that there's going to have to be something. Because a lot of my clients, Richard, they're small mom and pop.
Right.
They're renting out their properties, not because they're wealthy landowners and they have a huge portfolio. Some of them own 1 or 2 rental properties, and they use it to pay the mortgage. And when the tenant doesn't pay the rent, they have a hard time paying the mortgage.
Yeah, which overlaps into my world, where we're starting to see the forbearance window be really. There's, I think, almost 4 million homeowners are in forbearance now, and I wonder how many of those are coming from non-owner occupied properties. And then the burden you're talking about has now shifted over to these lenders, and so it's kind of like a passing of the buck. But yeah, at some point there needs to be some support from the government, I feel.
Yeah, I just really can't. I'm contemplating the future. I really do think that the Oakland statute is more than likely where things are going to go forward. So the Oakland statute you mentioned just a minute ago will allow you to sue and get a judgment that's probably worthless for the deferred rent, but not use that deferred rent, the unpayment of that deferred rent, as a basis to terminate the tenancy and get possession back.
Right.
It's a really significant difference in the Oakland statute. And when I read that, I thought to myself, this is more than likely what the future will look like across the state, because otherwise we're just going to have mass evictions. And I just really don't see the state and the courts being game for that.
Just from your own personal viewpoint, your own client base, how many of them have you seen have their tenants not pay so far? Is it a significant amount?
It's almost countless. I mean, I just have so many people calling right now, asking for advice. What do I do? The tenant hasn't paid the rent, and the advice I'm giving everyone right now is document everything, keep really good records, because you're going to need it at the end of the day. No matter what you're going to be able to do, when you get into litigation, it's essential that you have a good, solid record. And right. Without that, you're going to be really hamstrung.
Right. So even the breadth of your services are kind of limited right now because nothing's open, and you don't know what's gonna happen, right? So
right, yeah. So logistically, we're hamstrung right now, and it's really frustrating as a lawyer to have to tell somebody, "I'm really sorry, but the state has tied our hands." A big part of my counseling role and a big part of my role is talking to people and getting them not to do dumb things. Don't do
Right.
things out of emotion, right? When you're dealing with a landlord-tenant relationship, it's really easy to get emotional, and it's really a big mistake if you're a landlord to do something out of emotion rather than having a strategic plan in place for how you're going to handle this.
Can you give an example of that?
Yeah, like serving a notice or making a demand, sending an email to a tenant saying something to the effect of, you should apply for, federal assistance. You should do something where it's not a requirement of the law. There's no legal requirement that a tenant, even a commercial tenant, make an application to the Small Business Administration for a loan. So if you're a landlord and you're basically leaning on someone telling them they should do this when the motivation is your own self-interest and not the tenant's self-interest, you can open yourself up to claims of harassment, wrongful eviction, all sorts of things. So the number one thing I tell people is don't act out of emotion in this situation. Really get good, solid legal advice and have somebody help you out with that.
That's really good advice. Do you also recommend to your landlord clients to even reach out to their tenants, assuming that they're not in an emotional state? Do you recommend that they reach out to try to negotiate, or should they seek counsel first?
Well, on the commercial side, for example, it's really smart, right? So you could be right and have the basis, for example, for an eviction action at the end of this whole thing for rent that wasn't paid. But then you may be sitting with an empty storefront, right? I don't know what the commercial landscape is going to look like when we come all out of this. It's much, much better off to get into, and that's the thought process behind the San Francisco statute, is that the parties should negotiate a repayment plan in good faith. Similarly, on the residential side, I've heard from any number of leasing agents that the rents are going to be depressed when we come out of this, that the rental market will probably soften. So, working collaboratively with the tenant to get back into a repayment plan that can essentially get you something, maybe better than, having the opportunity to get a judgment, say in the small claims court, that it may be worthless.
Right. When you say that you think the rental market is going to soften as soon as we come out of this, are you referring to just San Francisco County or Bay Area, or just in general in the nation?
Yeah, I'm talking about it generally speaking, right? Like, so imagine that you own a commercial space and you have a commercial tenant, a restaurant, for example.
Right.
The restaurant, if you push and lean on the restaurant, even though you're legally able to do that, if the restaurant goes out of business or is unable to get caught up and you evict them, you may be sitting there, you may have a moral victory, right? You may win the battle but lose the war, because you may drive the restaurant out of business, and then you're sitting there with an empty, vacant space.
Right.
If you had negotiated with them and come up with some sort of repayment plan, and there are any number of ways you can structure that. You can do something on the back end, however the parties want to negotiate a repayment plan. It may be better than an all or nothing, where you're sitting with a vacant space.
Right. It's so true. Right? Because in this pandemic, there's just really not any bad players per se. I mean, any bad players that are humans, at least. So it's from an ethical standpoint, you have to feel for everybody who's been affected, including renters and including landlords, people who have been also been affected negatively from the health front. I mean, you take a step back and we have all these issues that we have to deal with, and then people are dying at the same time. So it's on different levels, we can still appreciate certain things we have, right? Both personally and professionally.
Yeah, and it's very frustrating, Richard. I mean, that's really a prescient observation. I had, for example, 2 evictions. I'll give you an example. I had an eviction action. I had a judgment for possession, a writ of possession at the sheriff's office. The sheriff's eviction was scheduled for March 18th in San Francisco. for a trial that I went to a jury trial I went to in February. And this is a nuisance tenant. This tenant is engaging in nuisance behavior. I have a judgment and a writ. The sheriff was about ready to come out on it. And we were all sent home on March 16th, and the sheriff informed us on the 17th that they weren't going to be coming out on the 18th. And so that landlord now is dealing with months and months and months of not being able to execute on the writ. But that's the exception, right? That's the exception, not the rule. A lot of what we're dealing with right now are tenants who, for no other reason that the economy has crashed, are unable to pay the rent.
Right.
So it's just, I mean, everybody's in the same position, but we have manifestly different ways that we get there. Some are just the unintended consequences of an unprecedented economic shutdown, and then in the other case, I have a tenant who just by sheer luck avoided having the sheriff come out and remove them.
Wow. Yeah.
So,
Unprecedented times. You're absolutely right, and I hope we can get through this relatively unscathed. You've given some great tips and suggestions for landlords out there. What's the best way for somebody to reach you?
The best way to reach me is to call my office number and to look me up online. Our website is bayareapropertylawyers.com. This is really the best way to get a hold of me. I have a whole staff that helps me take in clients and make sure that everybody gets responded to.
Bay Area Property Lawyers. bayareapropertylawyers.com.
That's
awesome.
Right. Yep.
Awesome.
Bay Area.
Well, Michael McLaughlin of McLaughlin Sanchez, thank you so much for your time again. I really appreciate that. It was great information. I hope everybody benefited from that. Stay safe, have a great weekend, and we'll talk soon.
Thanks, Richard. Appreciate it all as always. Talk to you soon.
Hello, everyone. I'm Richard Wong of Viridian Mortgage, and welcome to Ask and Answered, a video series that I created highlighting mostly attorneys dealing with COVID pandemic-related issues. In this day and age of constantly streaming information at our fingertips, it's sometimes easy to fall prey to sensory overload. And so the goal of this program is to hear firsthand from those professionals who are the experts dealing with these issues on a day-to-day basis and providing us with the clarity and direction we need during these challenging times. Thank you for watching. Be smart, stay safe, and take care.